Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every single weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, coming up on the programme. Lebanon welcomes the diplomatic initiative of France and the United States as those countries put forward a ceasefire proposal, but Israel instructs its military to fight on with full force. Lebanese officials say at least 23 people, mostly women and children, have been killed after an Israeli airstrike hit a building in northeastern Lebanon, as Israel says it hit 75 Hezbollah targets overnight. Hezbollah says it has bombed military industry complexes using salvos of rockets aiming at sites in northern Israel. And as Netanyahu arrives in New York as he prepares to address the United Nations Assembly on Friday. Warm welcome to our programme. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the military to continue operations in Lebanon with full force. That is despite calls for a 21-day ceasefire from the US, the UK and other allies. Well, this comes as the Israeli military reports striking approximately 75 Hezbollah targets overnight in the south of Lebanon and in the Bekaa Valley. Well, the Lebanese Health Ministry is reporting at least 13 fatalities from those strikes, bringing the number of people killed since Monday to more than 600. And today, Israel has been targeting the Beirut suburbs in a fresh wave of strikes. Well, for reaction to the latest diplomatic developments and for more analysis on where Lebanon could be heading to from here, I'm joined by Lebanon's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Rami Mortada. Your Excellency, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. I'd just like to ask you, first of all, for your reaction to the news that a ceasefire doesn't look like it's going to be happening.
Well, that's really unfortunate, facing this tragic and horrific ongoing Israeli military operation over Lebanon, carpet bombing throughout the country. And now the most recent strike is in the suburbs of Beirut. So we really hoped that last night that this document that was presented by international partners would offer a glimpse of hope. And we welcome any effort to secure a ceasefire and any effort to secure the implementation of Security Council resolutions in the region. However, what we saw today in Israel are successive statements coming out of different levels in the hierarchy, rejecting this offer. So we're still hoping for extensive efforts being deployed, and I think Israeli position currently puts it in confrontation with the international community, which has spoken yesterday very loudly.
Indeed, but I mean, if we look at Western intervention and the effect that that's having, which is more or less no impact at this particular stage, and the United States has been trying to broker ceasefires in Gaza for the last 10 months and hasn't managed to do that either. So if Israel doesn't listen to the United States, who is Israel going to listen to?
Well, I think all the levers that exist to influence Israeli behavior should be used, because what's at stake here is regional stability. It's not only about Lebanon, although Lebanon is in a horrific situation and sustaining the most bloody and violent military attack. But it's not only about Lebanon. What's at stake is regional stability. The world has on its conscience Gaza, the ongoing war now for a year in Gaza. We don't want Lebanon to become the second Gaza, with all the ramifications that add up in the region and beyond.
Is your understanding that were a ceasefire to be presented to Hezbollah, that they would accept it?
Well, we've said that we would be looking to the Israeli reaction to that. And we've always said, Lebanon has always said that we want a diplomatic solution to this current standoff. However, Israel had a different outlook. And here we are, we're witnessing this race to the bottom. We have a warmongering Israeli government that has chosen war as a path forward. And I think now that the international community has spoken through this a joint statement yesterday, I think they should put effort behind what they've said in the document and make sure that it is implemented.
And all the while, Israel saying it wants to completely destroy Hezbollah. Is that realistic? I mean, what's your reaction to a statement like that?
Well, we're used to unrealistic war aims that Israel has been now defining for a year. We've seen bringing the hostages back in Gaza. Where are the hostages today? We've seen eradicating Hamas. We've seen all the war aims that were defined. And now a new war aim, which is to bring the civilian population in Israel back to the north part of the country. I think there is no way that this could be achieved except by diplomatic solutions. So I think the fate of the Israeli leaders, they take precedence over their own citizens because there exists a diplomatic way forward. There exists a diplomatic way forward through stopping the slaughter in Gaza and simultaneously stopping the slaughter in Lebanon.
But if we assume that third-party diplomacy, and I'm talking here again most particularly about the United States, is going to be slow at best, ineffectual at worst. I mean, the buck stops, doesn't it, with Lebanon as well here, and Lebanon's diplomats and politicians really need to be a part of the solution as well, don't they?
Definitely. We've said we are ready to deploy all efforts to make sure that peace and de-escalation prevails. But today the ball is on the other side's hands.
And all the while, innocent Lebanese people are stuck in the middle between a conflict that they didn't start. This is about Hezbollah on the one side, the Israeli government on the other. But, you know, the vast majority of Lebanese people support really at heart neither of the two sides, do they?
It's not about Hezbollah anymore. It's about Lebanon. Hezbollah is part of Lebanon, but what's at stake today is Lebanon, because the areas and the civilians that are being slaughtered are not necessarily Hezbollah members or Hezbollah associated individuals. It's a carpet bombing for the whole country in Lebanon. So it's not about Hezbollah anymore, it's about Lebanon.
So basically, as a Lebanese person, that means you have no choice but to support Hezbollah in its continued provocations, because viewed from the Israeli side, what I keep hearing from Israeli politicians, Israeli military figures is, if Hezbollah keeps firing, as they have done for the last 11 and a half months, projectiles into our territory, what are we supposed to do? Sit there and do nothing?
That's a classical rhetoric that we've been hearing from the Israelis, always scapegoating and blaming others for the warmongering. If it's not Hezbollah, then it's Hamas. If it's not Hamas, they even bashed the UN because the Secretary General told them to hold back. It's always this paranoid, even Hezbollah, even everyone is saying that once it ends everywhere. Once they halt their military operations in Gaza, it will halt in Lebanon, and there is always a way to find a diplomatic solution.
Do you think there are any people in Lebanon who are thinking, actually, the Israelis have a point, and we'd quite like to see the back of Hezbollah ourselves? Do you think anyone has that opinion? And if they do, why aren't we hearing it?
Well, of course, in Lebanon, there are different views, but when it comes to Israel, when it becomes to Israeli behavior, I think all Lebanese are united in denouncing this behavior and resisting this aggression.
Do you think a ground invasion looks likely at this stage?
I hope not. I hope they've learned from history. They've tried it in 2006, and we've seen the outcome. They've tried it in 1982, and we've seen the outcome. This can only empower extremism. This can only empower maximalist positions. They are serving the opposite cause that they are claiming they want to serve.
What's the latest information you've got about the areas of Lebanon that have been targeted? We've got information about Christian towns that have been hit, which obviously have no affiliation, we assume, with Hezbollah. What's the latest you've got about who's being targeted and what that tells us about Israel's strategy here?
The only logic, I think, in targeting that the Israelis have is the one of inflicting maximum civilian casualties. Because if you want to follow the diagram of their targets, you don't find any rationale. I mean, what's the rationale in hitting a 6 stories building that everybody knows is, well, there are just ordinary civilians in it? So I think the real war aim is to shock and awe. The real aim is to intimidate. The real war aim is to reestablish what they think is the deterrence image, which I think is irreversibly tarnished.
How long can Lebanon hold out with this kind of Israeli bombardment going on?
Well, obviously, it's a tragic situation. Already the death toll is intolerable. But Lebanon is a resilient country and it can always bounce back. And with the spirit of national cohesion that we're seeing today in Lebanon, notwithstanding differences, but Israel will never be able to exploit these differences. So the country will hold and will tolerate, notwithstanding, of course, the difficult situation, the tragic situation that we're going through.
And how would you characterize it? Would you call this a war? Would you call it an invasion, a special military operation? What's your word for this?
It's an all-out aggression with war crimes being committed, and which has not just started on Monday. It had started before. I mean, take the pages, which has been described by the United Nations itself of war crimes, because when you detonate devices in a civilian medium without prior knowledge of who is at the time of the attack in possession of these devices, this is a violation to international humanitarian law. And yet, the denialism in Israel, we hear statements that this was a targeted attack.
And when you look at the death toll, and you've mentioned it's an intolerable death toll, there are images we're seeing every day of houses being destroyed, people's livelihoods being destroyed. I mean, apart from the human cost, there's a financial cost to all of this. Who's going to pay for this damage? Is Hezbollah going to pay for it? Will insurers pay for it? Would Israel pay for it? What do you think?
Well, you know, as Lebanon has been for the last 10 years undertaking a global public good. It's a country hosting refugees. It's a country that has been hostage to many regional conflicts. So I think there is a need in due course for some sort of a reconstruction effort, which should be supported by the international community.
How are you feeling personally? You're based in London. You're far away from where this is all happening, and you're having to see your people suffering on a day-to-day basis now. How does that make you feel personally?
Well, clearly I'm appalled. I'm far away in London, but I have close family now with risks for their lives. So I think if you would ask any Lebanese, whether in Lebanon or overseas, he would tell you that we're just shocked and appalled and frustrated and revolted against this criminal behavior that Israel is inflicting on our country.
And what's your message to the wider world? What would you like to tell people as a call to action, or some sort of a message you think people need to hear about this conflict?
Well, Lebanon has always been a peaceful country. As I said, it has been undertaking a global public good now for years, hosting 2 million refugees for a country of 4 million. Lebanon is a country of deep and proud culture and creative industries. Lebanon is this beautiful country in the region, and it's currently being destroyed by Israel. But as I said, the country will bounce back.
And we've heard about border crossings between Lebanon and Syria being struck, 4 of them in particular, 4 key border crossings. Why is Israel hitting those targets, do you think?
Because it wants to block any way out for Lebanese fleeing for their lives towards Syria. That's another criminal war tactic. They're taking civilians as hostages. I think we're witnessing the same playbook that was used in Gaza in the current, last year. It's exactly the same terror playbook. The same toolkit is being used, except that this time it has real risks for regional spillover.
And with regards to that spillover, I mean, one of the topics we're discussing today on this program is, what the scope of a broader regional war might be. I mean, what would you envisage were this to erupt into a full-blown war involving the region? What would the region actually, what would that mean? Which countries would end up being involved?
We all know the geopolitics of the region, and we hope that we would not get there and that diplomacy and wisdom will prevail and that we will be able to reverse this horrific trend. But at the same time, the social fabric of the region is shared by all its countries. So it's so difficult to confine and contain one single conflict in one theater. That's why we said it's of utmost importance to stop the current Israeli aggression, especially that there is an alternative diplomatic way. It's really an unnecessary war, except for restoring deterrence, Israeli deterrence, except for maybe Israeli leaders escaping internal domestic accountability and hence wanting to put their countries on a continual path of war and violence. This war serves no purpose. And as I said, it's not about Hezbollah, it's about Lebanon, because the country itself, its people throughout their views and differences and the things they agree upon or disagree upon. But today they're all united in confronting this aggression.
And what's the role of the Lebanese army in all of this? And were there to be an invasion on the ground, would the Lebanese army be fighting side by side with Hezbollah? How would that work?
Well, as any army, no army can sit idly when it sees an enemy invading his country. That's the most generic answer that I can give you. I think the Lebanese army is a national institution that enjoys huge popular support in Lebanon. And in due course, it will undertake its duty of that it has always, as it has always done, to defend the national territories and the people of Lebanon. Sure, it's not about fighting side by Hezbollah. The Lebanese army are the prime armed force responsible for the defense of the country.
And of course, there's UNIFIL on the ground. There's around 10,000 UNIFIL soldiers on the ground there. And I'm just wondering what their role as peacekeepers is going to have to turn into if there's a war going on around them. It's something I can't comprehend, being a peacekeeper in the midst of a war. I mean, would they be told to leave? Would they be told to stand down?
I think it's their mission is of vital importance, because at some point we would need to empower UNIFIL for it to play its role as described by Security Council Resolution 1701. So UNIFIL has been doing an excellent job for decades now. And one should not underestimate the contribution of UNIFIL to peace and stability. Of course, its mission is heavily challenged, and it's challenged by Israel. Actually, it has always been challenged by Israel. Israel always looked at UNIFIL has belittled the importance of UNIFIL because they don't want eyewitnesses on the ground. You know, UNIFIL reports regularly on its theater of operation. That's why Israel always targeted, and they even physically targeted UNIFIL back in 96 and 2006. They lost lives. I hope this time that there will be no losses amongst amongst UNIFIL, but I think it's a very important and a mission of strategic importance.
And what do you make of the news we've learnt in the course of this evening that Israel says it secured this $8.7 billion aid package from the United States? This is to support, quote, its ongoing military efforts. What do you think about Israel being given $8.7 billion by the United States, who then put forward a ceasefire proposal that Israel seems not to be at all interested in and frankly has ignored? What's your thinking here?
Well, that's why I said all the levers that anyone could have to help influence Israeli behavior should be used. So if this money was given for nothing, it's unfortunate. Anyway, it's a bilateral relationship. I think it's not for me to comment on how the United States might build its bilateral relations. But what I would say is that we need honest brokers in the region. It's a very complex region, and the United States remains a superpower, and we count on its role in brokering some sort of an arrangement, an alternative to war and death and destruction.
Just lastly, I'd just like to get your thoughts looking forward. I mean, where you see things heading to from here. If this ceasefire hasn't worked out, we've got the UN General Assembly ongoing. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, due to address that body tomorrow. Where do you see events, how do you see events unfolding during the course of the next few days?
Well, what I can tell you is that the same arrangement that we would be able to conclude sparing a new round of violence is the same one that we would conclude after in a month or 2 months. The only difference is that civilians would have paid the price. So there is really no need for this round of violence because a diplomatic alternative exists. Now we are faced with an uncertain era ahead. You know, the American elections, we have the internal dynamics inside Israel where there is an extreme right coalition and a difficult coalition to hold. So it's a really complex situation ahead. That's why I hope that things will be curbed as soon as possible before we enter into additional complications.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Lebanon's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Rami Mortada. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Well, in an interview with my colleague Hadley Gamble, the former Lebanese MP Walid Jumblat said that Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't care about the US representative. This after he launched the attack on Lebanon just one day after the US Special Envoy Amos Hochstein was in Israel.
How telling was it that the attacks on Hezbollah came just one day after the U.S. representative was in Israel having meetings to calm the situation.
It means that they don't care about the U.S. representative. They just don't care. I mean, you're speaking about Hochstein.
Yes.
He doesn't care. The Israelis, Netanyahu, doesn't care about him. He dismisses any effort, although minimal, of U.S. administration to try to appease a little bit, to cool it down.
Well, for more analysis, I'm joined here in the studio by our chief US correspondent, Simon Moggs. Simon, very warm welcome to you. Great to have you with us here in the studio. I just want to start by asking you how you'd characterize the state of relations between Israel and the United States right now.
Well, I think in a word, Tom, very complicated. I mean, there's no question about that. The United States government feels enormous frustration over its dealings with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet. I think unprecedented in the modern era in terms of how difficult that relationship has become. And yet, even within the last few hours, Israel has announced that it's receiving another $8.7 billion in military assistance from the United States. President Biden continues to maintain that American support for Israel is ironclad, that the country, as he said at the United Nations just the other day, had a right and a responsibility to react in the aftermath of October the 7th. And yet, clearly, there are deep frustrations and deep fissures between the Israeli War Cabinet and the Prime Minister and his American interlocutors. And what has been so astounding to witness over the last few months is the number of occasions when Antony Blinken has travelled to the region, he's met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's come out and he said there's been some kind of a breakthrough. We've secured an agreement, particularly with advancing the talks about the possibility of a ceasefire. And within an hour, 2 hours of Antony Blinken's departure from Israel, the Israeli Prime Minister publicly has pulled the rug out from beneath him. And that is very, very grating for the Americans.
Indeed, as you say, a huge sense of frustration there in DC. And I'm assuming that with the US presidential election just 5 weeks away now, foreign policy, which isn't typically something at the forefront of people's minds, is now quite prominent in terms of what's being said on the campaign trail.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's worth also just noting that with now, around 115 days left in Joe Biden's presidency, because we all now know when he leaves office, he becomes something of a lame duck, and the Israelis are taking some advantage of that. And there is obviously doubt about who will succeed him. Will it be, as President Biden insists, Kamala Harris, who has said that she will not be silent about what is taking place at the hands of the Israeli military in Gaza and now also in the West Bank. But she hasn't indicated precisely how that transfers into policy changes. And Donald Trump, who, of course, is mounting vigorous attacks on Iran on the campaign trail, insisting, again, without providing any detail, that he can resolve the crisis in the Middle East in 24 hours should he be elected president. What is interesting about this election cycle, and it's the first time that we've seen this, again in the modern era, is that the votes of Arab Americans, particularly in crucial battleground states like Michigan, cannot be taken for granted by the Democrats. So many Arab Americans have said they simply will not turn out and vote for Kamala Harris, although there has been some shift in that over the last 24 hours with one large advocacy group representing Arab American voices saying that it is endorsing Kamala Harris for the presidency because they see her as the lesser of two evils in terms of the choice American voters are facing. But there's no doubt Kamala Harris has got a lot of work ahead to try and get that vote out for her, because there is so much frustration felt across the Arab American community with the Biden-Harris administration's handling of the situation.
And is there a sense that a Trump administration would have an enormous bearing on events in the Middle East? Would it change very much?
Everything with Donald Trump, in every regard, is always transactional. His relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he says, became strained. He wasn't happy with some of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu said and did in the final days of his own presidency and then in its aftermath. Is that going to be a relationship that quickly gets put back together? Who will the Sherpas be for all of that? Are we going to see Jared Kushner returning to a position of influence and power in a second Trump administration? He's not been evident on the campaign trail at all, and his wife, the president's daughter Ivanka, has totally taken herself out of the political conversation. Trump absolutely is going to be, should he be elected, leading an administration that is deeply hostile to Iran, even though we heard at the United Nations this week relatively conciliatory messages from Masoud Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president. What kind of approach is he going to take? It's very, very difficult to divine because there have been so few specifics offered, but equally very few specifics offered, as I was saying, by Kamala Harris.
Let's turn our attention to the UN General Assembly, and I assume there's been a great flurry of activity there in New York on the sidelines, if not in the main auditorium.
Yeah, massive activity by Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, trying to put together, succeeding in putting together, this 12-country alliance that has called for a 21-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Hezbollah. And that, of course, is designed, as Joe Biden always does, to demonstrate that he's got international solidarity and to put pressure on both the governments of Lebanon and Israel to find a way of stepping back, in the case of the Israelis, from the brink. The Israelis, another example of Benjamin Netanyahu absolutely pulling the rug out from beneath Joe Biden, saying that he had no interest in this call for the ceasefire by the US and its dozen or so allies. It remains to be seen whether all of that hard work behind the scenes by Antony Blinken can actually succeed in delaying the inevitability of a possible Israeli ground assault on Lebanon, a ground assault that many observers in the United States, foreign policy analysts argue, cannot work if its stated goal is to destroy Hezbollah, any more than the assault in Gaza has worked trying to destroy Hamas. That ultimately you have to engage diplomatically and politically to try and change things, rather than simply thinking that military might in either of those cases is going to work.
OK, well, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu due to address the UN General Assembly on Friday. That's tomorrow. We'll have to wait and see what he says and what kind of a welcome he gets there as well. But thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Our Chief US Correspondent, Simon Marks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, let's get some more analysis on the situation on the ground and the tactics on the battlefield. We can speak to retired four-star general who served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Philip Breedlove. General Breedlove, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. The latest on the diplomatic front is that we hear Israel is flatly rejecting this 21-day ceasefire proposal that was championed by the United States and France. Instead, Israel vowing to continue the fight with the full force until victory. That's their words. What does victory look like, do you think, to the Israelis?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, and I'm happy to talk with you today. Victory, I think, first and foremost, is that Iran and its proxies stop firing missiles into Israel. I think the goals of Israel have, whether we agree with them or not, have been pretty clear, and that is to eliminate the terrorist threat to Israel. So far, the terrorists have not chosen to stop. And I think it's important every time we have this conversation, it's really important to remember everything starts in Iran and everything ends in Iran. And so these actions of the proxies against Israel are for a purpose and at a purpose for Iranians' ends and goals.
It's a similar stated goal to Israel's goal in Gaza, which was to destroy Hamas. And yet, time and time again, we speak to analysts, regional experts who say you can't destroy Hamas. Now we're hearing people saying you can't destroy Hezbollah. These are organizations that don't necessarily have an HQ with the word Hezbollah on the exterior. These are ideas, these are ideologies that exist within the homes of people, in the minds of people, in communities, and it simply can't be done. So do you think it's a realistic goal to call off diplomacy until something unrealistic can be achieved?
Well, we always have to have diplomacy. Everything ends in diplomacy, even wars of complete defeat. There's diplomacy and an agreement at the end of them. So diplomacy can't fall by the wayside. We need to keep it up. But you need two realistic and honest participants to negotiate. And right now, it's very clear that Hamas and Hezbollah, they have no intention of stopping attacking Israel. I think it's very clear that both Hamas and Hezbollah and their Iranian backers and bosses, I think they all understand that Hezbollah and Hamas will never defeat Israel. But if they keep kicking the hornet's nest, if they keep agitating and killing Israelis, then Israel is going to respond. And what Hamas and Hezbollah are counting on is that the world opinion and frankly, journalists and everyone else will turn against Israel, and they will defeat Israel for Hamas and Hezbollah, because Hamas and Hezbollah absolutely, completely know they cannot defeat Israel. They need the Western world to defeat Israel for them.
But I think it's fair to say that, terrorizing the Lebanese population, the majority of whom do not support Hezbollah, is not necessarily the right way to go around securing Israel's northern border.
I will agree with part of what you said. We do not support nor want this to impact the people of either Gaza or Lebanon. I mean, I don't think that anybody even believes that's what Israel wants to do. If they do, I think they're mistaken. Israel doesn't want that. But Israel has to defend itself, in my opinion, against these two terrorist organizations, and most importantly, against Iran, who, once again, I want to point out, is behind it all. And so when Hezbollah and Hamas hide themselves among the populace, use the populace as a human shield, hide in homes among other homes, this is what happens. And so what, if anything, are we going to see from the people of Gaza or the people of Lebanon to reject Hamas and reject Hezbollah? Some of the Hamas leaders are among the richest people in this world. Where is their money trying to fix what's going on in Gaza? We see clearly that these two terrorist organizations and their sponsors in Iran are using the plight of the people in Gaza and Lebanon to affect what we talked about before. The terrorists, need the world to defeat Israel for them because they are incapable of defeating Israel.
And just drawing on your military background, your military knowledge, which is extremely rich, looking at the targets that the Israeli military has been striking, they say we've hit some 75 terror targets in the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon, also in the south. Just looking at the sorts of targets that have been hit up until now, what does that tell us about what Israel is specifically trying to achieve here?
So I think there's two thrusts to what they're doing, two types of targets. One set of targets are obviously military targets. They are storage areas, missile launching sites, and so forth. The Israeli intelligence is extremely good, and they are striking those known targets. You saw just the other day the picture of the missile inside the home among other homes. This is the way that Hezbollah operates. But on the other side, which I think is being very successful, they are striking leadership. If you look at the top of either Hamas or Hezbollah leadership, and if you had plotted that organizational chart, say 2 or 3 months ago, and now you look at that chart and who has been eliminated, these organizations are in disarray because they are systematically taking out leadership. And once again, these leaders cloak themselves in the people of both Lebanon and Gaza. So it's a hard target to strike, and to strike precisely, and to try to limit collateral damage. And therefore you see some loss, as we discussed.
And just specifically with regards to Hezbollah's capability, when you compare where they are today to where they were, say, 2 weeks ago, and that was prior to the attacks on their communication systems, the pages that blew up, the walkie-talkies, and the targeted attacks that have taken out some of the senior individuals. We gather even today, the head of the drone-making team in Hezbollah has been targeted. We don't know if he's being killed or not. But how much weakened would you say has Hezbollah been by events during the course of the last 10 days, 2 weeks?
Well, I am not the expert on that organizational chart, but I have read from several who are world leaders in this kind of thought, and they are attributing a pretty fair impact based on who and when they have been killed. I used their words earlier. I'm sort of quoting the reading I'm doing, which says that the leadership is a bit in disarray because they're being disassembled from the top, and this is going to be a problem. But the sad news is, remember, and this will be the third time I've said it, this is about Iran, and Iran will supply the money and try to replace these leaders in order to keep their proxies stirring up Israel.
And just going back to battlefield tactics, there is lots of speculation about what Israel's going to do next. A ground invasion, something a lot of people talking about. We haven't heard whether that's definitely going to happen or not, but certainly there are quite a lot of noises that suggest that a ground invasion could be imminent. Would that be advisable from a military point of view?
Well, I think it's exactly what Hezbollah wants. Let's just remember one more time. Hezbollah knows they cannot defeat Israel militarily. And so they need Israel to kill innocents in their attempts to take out Hezbollah. They need the world and the world press to take out Israel because they can't. And so I believe that Hezbollah will keep prodding and keep prodding and keep prodding until Israel effects a more damaging war, because that's what Hezbollah needs and that's what Hezbollah wants in Lebanon.
But militarily speaking, would a ground invasion be more or less dangerous, hazardous for the general population than, say, airstrikes, where...
Of course it would. Of course it would. Right now, we're watching Israel striking as precisely as possible, and it's not always possible, using highly precise weapons to take out very discrete targets. When you go in a ground war, there is less discretion. There has to be.
Oh, just for the benefit of our viewers as well, and I have to say this, that only last week there was a case in the south of Beirut where one top commander was killed, but that did come at the expense of some 50 other lives. So I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. But I just want to ask you next about the risk of escalation.
Well, whose choice was that? Whose choice was that?
No, but there were women and children.
That leader surrounded himself with innocents. That leader hides among the innocents. Their facilities are hiding among the innocents. So I think clearly the decision to do that was costly, and I agree with you. 50 is a tough number. I'm not arguing with you. I'm just trying to fix the blame where it belongs, and that is with the terrorists.
Sure, and I just want to ask you next about where you see this heading to, because ever since the 7th of October, we've talked about the dangers of this escalating into a full-blown regional war. Are we looking like we're heading in that direction, would you say?
I don't think so. And here's why. Once again, fourth time now, this is all about Iran. Iran doesn't want a regional war because that might involve Iran, and Iran knows that it would lose in a regional war, and that its proxies would lose in a regional war. I, once again, would just offer that Iran needs to keep kicking the hornet's nest, keep agitating Israel, keep killing Israelis so that Israel will react, and then the world will try to stop Israel.
And which countries do you think would be involved were things to escalate? I mean, what would be the scope of an escalate? I know you don't think it's likely to happen, but were things to escalate to the point that this full-blown regional war that we've heard so much about for the last 11 and a half months, were that scenario to be realized? I mean, just how broad could the area involved actually be?
I think that would be completely up to the Iranians. Whoever their proxies fire at, they would probably become involved. So whoever Iran directs their proxies to attack, those would probably become involved. We know that the United States will be involved because we've already, when Iran has attacked into Israel directly from Iran, U.S. forces have thwarted and shot down missiles and provided air defense, et cetera, et cetera. So we know the United States would be involved. But beyond that, I think Iran controls. If they direct their proxies to attack different countries, then I expect those countries would become involved.
And just lastly, General, just talking about the United States and diplomatic efforts to bring about a resolution to these two crises. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's been, I believe, more than 10 times now to the region to try to broker a truce since the 7th of October. There was a truce in November of last year, but there hasn't been another one since then in Gaza. And this latest initiative to introduce a ceasefire in Lebanon has been flatly rejected by the Israelis. I mean, do you slightly get the impression that the Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu is not really paying a huge amount of attention to the US Secretary of State?
Well, what I would say is, much like in the United States as it relates to Ukraine, the type of response that Israel is going to have is deeply tied to political lines and political positions. And Mr. Netanyahu has a particular support base and a particular way of approaching this war. There are others in this country that have different thoughts, but right now he's in charge, and so they will proceed to track. Much like in America when it comes to Ukraine, Ukraine has been completely politicized. We're not making decisions in America about what's right for the world and what's right for Ukraine and what's right for Europe. It's rather wrapped up in political positions. And so I think that that we will see a continuation of sort of present course in Israel. But again, this completely relies on what Hezbollah and Hamas do. If they stop firing missiles and attacking Israel, I think very good things could and should happen. But as long as they keep firing missiles to keep Israel stirred up, then it's not going to go well.
And just an extension of that point, I mean, we've got an election looming in the United States in about 5 weeks from now. Do you think that's the outcome of that election is likely to have a significant bearing on these events thousands of kilometers away?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Retired four-star General Philip Breedlove. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, let's get the latest now on the humanitarian situation on the ground in Lebanon. And we can speak to Dr. Tania Baban, who is the Lebanon country director of the medical charity MedGlobal. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. 75 targets were hit overnight. I just wondered if you could start by bringing us up to speed on what you've heard about the scale of the damage from the latest attacks.
So what we know so far, Tom, is that at least 90,000 people have been newly displaced since this military escalation started on September 19. And this is adding to the already 100,000+ people who were being displaced slowly over the last 11 months. The Lebanese Ministry of Health has reported that nearly 600 people have been killed since Monday, and including 50 children and 58 women, and approximately 1,700 people have been injured. We've been seeing the massive displacements of tens of thousands of people coming into Beirut from the south, from the Biqa, from the Baalbek area, and we're still seeing the numbers flooding in. Every time we go on the field to do an assessment to see the numbers in the schools turned shelters, we still see them coming in. We're doing needs assessments on a daily basis. We started distributing basic need kits on the first day, and that included 100 mattresses, 100 packs of kitchen utilities, clothing, shoes, including anti-lice medication. This is really ongoing, and it changes on an hourly basis.
I'm just wondering, is the Lebanese government sort of leading the way here, or is it really up to NGOs and the solidarity of Lebanese society to sort of help each other out? I mean, what are you seeing?
So we've been seeing a lot of personal initiatives, really, which has been very heartwarming. But obviously, the Ministry of Health has been very involved from the very beginning. They started planning and gearing up for the possibility of mass casualties and training hospital frontliners to receive that amount of patients 11 months ago. So that, in addition to the national cluster, the health cluster that coordinates all the international and local NGOs that work in the healthcare system, so that we can align our activities and not overlap in areas or in material. So this has been very closely coordinated, very closely monitored, and the Ministry of Health is very active, and they're doing an amazing job, really. I mean, on the day of the beeper detonation, they were able to dispatch 2,800 ambulances within 1 hour, and that's because we were able to proudly with them establish what we're calling a command and control center, and that's just to be able to coordinate these dispatches with the hospitals and doing the triages while they're on the way to the hospital, so that we can decrease the risk of patient morbidity and decrease deaths.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about the Lebanese health system and what it's had to go through in the last few years. I mean, you think about COVID, the Beirut explosion, then we've had this economic crisis, which has seen hundreds of doctors decide to leave Lebanon and go and live abroad out of necessity to make a living. I mean, and now this. I mean, it really makes you wonder how the health system can sustain such a level of pressure. How long do you think this is sustainable for?
Absolutely, Tom. The healthcare system has been through a lot. Let me remind you that Lebanon in the region really has one of the most skilled number of physicians and healthcare workers, including healthcare facilities. We've lost 30% of that human resources, but a lot of the doctors are still here. Our doctors are very highly skilled, very qualified, all of whom are either American board, European board, or Canadian board certified, and they're trying to do their absolute best with the support of the Ministry of Health, with the support of the resources that are coming through the INGOs. How long will this last? It would depend on how long this war would last. Whatever we're doing to maximize our efforts to save as many lives as possible. But this is not sustainable on the long run. I mean, as of the 25th of September, as of yesterday, carrier flights who are coming in with possible shipments that we were donating to the Ministry of Health have been stopped. So now we have to think of alternative routes to get our shipments into the country. And that's a horrifying scenario. I mean, we learned from what we saw in Gaza that they were locked in without the ability to bring in resources. And if that happens in Lebanon as well, we see a humanitarian catastrophe that's about to happen. And, and we're really pleading that this should stop. Enough bloodshed, enough civilian casualties. Civilians should not be a target. Children should not be a target. Medical healthcare workers should not be a target. And this war has been going on for almost a year. Thousands of people, innocent civilians, have lost their lives, and it's starting again in Lebanon. And this really needs to stop.
Yeah, indeed. I was just thinking about the airport with the fact that so few flights are now operational between Lebanon and the rest of the world. I believe there's only the national carrier of Lebanon that's operating flights right now. And as you say, the supplies aren't coming through. The medicines won't be aboard those planes that would normally be aboard them. What sort of supplies do you see running out first? And is any aid managing to get through on the flights that are coming back? Because presumably passenger flights are leaving full of people and coming back relatively empty. Does that mean that perhaps there's scope for bringing more supplies back in on those flights?
We're trying to find alternative routes, definitely. What we saw already run out within 2 days of receiving the displaced people into Beirut were the mattresses. You know, the Minister of Education turned all the schools into shelters to absorb as many people as possible. And we were able to assess more than 35 schools. Certain complexes house more than 10,000 people. So last night, MedGlobal staff went on the ground and distributed more than 100 mattresses because a lot of people, disabled children, elderly patients, were sleeping on cardboards. And as of yesterday, Beirut ran out of mattresses. So we had to go out of the city, out of the capital, to be able to find those, to get them and distribute them. But I see that expanding to everything else. We already started seeing inflation in food. So the bread started increasing in its prices. I'm sure medications will be next. Already, as you mentioned, since the economic crisis and since the collapse in 2019, people can't afford their basic chronic medications. So whatever we still have standing is because of the aid and the help that is coming through. If that is to stop, then this is going to be a massacre.
I mean, it's extraordinary to be reading that some 20,000 people have already fled Lebanon, crossed the border into Syria. I mean, that's a real story of the reversal of fortunes for those two countries. And it's not to say that things in Syria are by any means stable or comfortable for people who are arriving there. But I'm just wondering, I mean, what choices people have at this stage. I mean, where can people flee to if they're being told to leave their homes, particularly in the south or in the Bekaa Valley? Where can people go?
So we know that the people are displacing to Beirut. Some have moved to the Bekaa, which is not very safe. This is central west Bekaa. But also we're seeing some displacement that is happening towards the north. So we saw a lot of people get into Tripoli and the northern parts of Lebanon. But where can people go? You're completely right. People have to leave their homes and they're leaving everything behind. And I find it very very difficult to think that the easiest thing for us to ask people is where would you go, rather than ask people to stop this war. So instead of asking people to leave their homes, to leave everything they know behind, we need to have the people involved, the politicians, the people in power, sit on a table and discuss this to stop this escalation, to stop this bloodshed.
Just another sort of anecdotal story I wanted to ask you about is the fake news that's doing the rounds at the moment on social media. There are false reports of the military escalation in some parts of the country that are then debunked. I've been reading about that in L'Orient Le Jour, the Lebanese daily. And I'm just wondering, what is a reliable source of information for people there on the ground? If people want reliable information about where they should go to, where they should flee from, where there might be food distribution centres. What's the source of information?
So there are internal groups. So as humanitarians, as the health cluster, we circulate this information that comes out of the Ministry of Health amongst ourselves. We have coordinating groups that get in touch, that divide the areas, that divide the resources, that divide the schools to be able to align that work and for us to be working simultaneously. And we circulate that comes out of the governments. So we only use information that we know is credible to be able to follow. follow. When it comes to the people, these are usually being circulated, on WhatsApp, they're being shared in certain groups, or they're being shared on social media. So people are able to do that. On the first day of displacement, we saw a lot of people sharing their concern about having nowhere to stay on social media. And really, the public came rushing to help, and they would send them details of houses they can rent, where shelters were being held, and giving that information online. So people have access to that. And there's been an amazing surge of community assistance and personal initiatives that have been really heartwarming.
Yeah, that must give people a lot of cause for hope and optimism at a very dark time. And I just want to ask you about your personal experience. I mean, you're on the front line. I don't know exactly where you are, but have you felt that you're personally in danger?
I'm in Beirut, so I'm in central Beirut. I'm 10 minutes away from the areas that are being attacked in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And personally, I had to obviously ask my parents to leave the country, because that kind of puts less pressure on me, having to wonder whether or not I'll be able to find their medications, if any of them get sick, whether or not I'll be able to rush them to the hospital. The hospitals are already overwhelmed. But also, my friends have advised me to have a go bag. I had never even heard of that term before, but I have a go bag ready by the door, including just documents and some cash, should we need to evacuate. But the question comes back to what you asked me. If I do have to evacuate, where do I go? It's a very difficult scenario to think of. And every time you try to put yourself in the place of the displaced people, it's very heartbreaking, because it's very difficult to imagine this happening to yourself. And you feel that, you're in a blessed position to be able to be the person providing the help rather than needing it. And this is what keeps us going on a daily basis. We're working up to 3, 4 a.m. in the morning, and we're not stopping. We're going to keep doing this until we help every person we possibly can.
No, well, I'm sure your help is hugely appreciated, and we wish you all the very best. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Tania Baban, Lebanon Country Director for the medical charity MedGlobal. Thank you. Well, let's get some more analysis on the legality of the conflict in Lebanon and indeed in Gaza. We can speak to William Schabas, who's Professor of International and Criminal Law at Middlesex University. Professor, thank you for joining us. You're an expert in international human rights law, international criminal law. You've written extensively on these subjects and many others. You're also the former chair of the UN committee which investigated the role of Israel in the 2014 Israel-Gaza conflict. If you will, I'd like to start by talking about what's happening in Lebanon, very much in the main body of our news at the moment. More than 600 people have been killed there in recent days. Would you say up until this point, and I know the laws of war are complicated, this is grey territory because Israel says that Hezbollah is not a state, well, Hezbollah is not a state, it's obviously a body within a state. Is Israel acting legally or illegally in what's happening in Lebanon?
You have to look at this question there are two dimensions to it. The first is whether the use of force at all is lawful. Israel is going to argue that they're being attacked from inside Lebanon, and so they're entitled to use force in self-defense. This is almost a mantra in the discussions where people defend Israel's conduct by saying, well, they're entitled to act in self-defense. I find that to be a rather sterile avenue, because the real question is whether the actions that they undertake in self-defense, allegedly, are in fact legitimate in terms of the laws and customs of war, that is, the conduct of the conflict. So this involves issues about targeting, about what they're trying to accomplish, about trying to peer through their motives to see if this is really, again, in Gaza, it was a question of recovering the hostages, and whether that was really what they were up to, or whether really the underlying theme of the conflict was actually to make Gaza unlivable and in some way or another clear the entire territory of Palestinians. So I think in southern Lebanon, this is perhaps not quite the same issue, but there's no doubt that when we see these huge numbers of civilian casualties, that it looks really like this is a pattern. This is the way Israel conducted the conflict in Gaza, and they're going ahead now in southern Lebanon with the same kind of indifference to casualties among non-combatants. And this is obviously raising issues about the legality of the way they're conducting the conflict.
But Israel would argue, and just, on that issue of legitimate self-defense, I mean, we're talking about Hezbollah here, which has repeatedly attacked Israel for more than 11 months. I mean, there had to come a point when Israel hit back, and legally speaking, I mean, 11 months of documented attacks on a nation by, albeit a non-state actor, which Hezbollah is, does merit the argument self-defense, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not really trying to quarrel about that issue, and I don't think that whether Hezbollah is the state of Lebanon, which it's not, or whether it's a non-state actor, really changes very much, because the fact is there is a conflict going on, and the attitude to be taken to the proportionality of the means that are used, to the choice of weapons, to the targeting, all of this really is the same whether Hezbollah is a state or whether it's a non-state actor. This is really not an important issue. It has no great significance or none at all from a legal standpoint. So Israel is required to act proportionately, and that means that in effect they have to protect civilian non-combatants from the conflict. And they have to target the combatants. And what we're seeing, as we've seen for the last 11 months, almost a year now, in Gaza, is that the civilians bear the brunt of the attacks. And that leads to the suggestion that it's not just being indifferent to the casualties among the civilians, but that in some way the civilians are themselves the target.
And what is the legality with regards to giving prior warning to, for example, an airstrike on an area that's densely populated, as Israel has done in, for example, the southern suburbs of Beirut, but also in Gaza? What is the obligation legally for a nation to forewarn people on the ground that such a strike is imminent?
Well, there's no rule about this. It's not like we have an app on our iPhone telling us how much notice you have to give and to whom you have to give the notice. The idea of giving the notice is to respect the idea that civilians are given a chance to get out of the way. And then the question really is the reality of the warning, whether the warning is in fact given with sufficient time and whether the civilians have some place to go, in fact, if they flee whatever the target is that's being contemplated. We saw this in the conflict in 2014, where Israel would target a building, for example, where there were civilians living in the building, and they had the telephone numbers. They would telephone people, and they would also do something they called roof knocking, where they would let off a small bomb on the roof of the building at the upper floor. And this was to warn the civilians that, get out as quickly as you could. So sometimes the civilians had enough time to get out. And so it was very correct that Israel did this. In other times, it was kind of meaningless. There would be large families. The lifts weren't working in the buildings. They had to run down the stairs. And the warning wasn't really sufficient enough to achieve what its alleged purpose was. So it looked good on paper, but the reality of it was quite different.
So what you're saying is that when, for example, Israel drops leaflets on an area, as they have done in parts of Lebanon, as they did in parts of Gaza, when they send these automated messages to people's telephones saying, evacuate to a safe area, are you basically saying this is window dressing? It's to make them look good on the international stage?
Well, I think you have to look at this on a case-by-case level. You have to look at each specific incident and to see how real and how significant that was, and then draw conclusions. I'm not in a position to do this. I know that Israel does it. I know that the Palestinians in Gaza are constantly complaining that the notice isn't sufficient enough, or that they have no place to go, that there's no safe place. And as you know, the Palestinians in Gaza have been on a kind of a game of musical chairs where they have to move every few weeks to another area because the area where they've been told to move as a safe zone is no longer safe. So it's about the reality of that, and I'm personally too far away from the ground to be able to tell you how much of it is real and how much of it is is window dressing, as you say.
And what about the booby traps in the pagers and the walkie-talkies? I mean, that's something the like of which no one's ever seen before. It's a tactic that hasn't been used, as far as anyone's aware, on a scale like that in living memory. Does that pose any legal issues as far as you're concerned?
Yes, it does. I mean, I think that the use of these booby-trapped telephones or pagers, and there were reports of other things, everything from solar panels to mobile phones and walkie-talkies and so on. I don't know how much of that. I think we're still waiting to get the full truth on how all of that worked. But very clearly, the danger of that is that you can give somebody what in effect is a booby-trapped item that is going to go off at some point. But when it goes off, you don't know whether they're going to be sitting around, whether they're going to be in a hospital visiting a patient who's ill, and so on. It's a way of targeting somebody, but it lacks. It's an indiscriminate weapon. I think that's the term for it, because you cannot control the environment where the bomb is going to go off. And when the day of the incident, I remember there were, I think they said in southern Lebanon, there were 12 deaths that day. This was a figure that I heard, I think, the day after. And of the 12, 4 of them were medical personnel and 2 of them were civilians who were clearly non-combatants, women or children or something. So that sort of confirmed the danger of doing this sort of a technique. To some extent, and there'll be debates about this, about whether you can booby-trap things for soldiers under ordinary circumstances or not. And there's a debate among the lawyers who are advising the military and everything about whether you can kill somebody when there's some other way of immobilizing them as a combatant. Because the goal always, according to the laws of war, is that you're trying to remove the combatant from the battlefield, but to do it in the way that's the least destructive and inhumane possible. We call it sometimes the kill or capture debate, but it once again, it's all about this proportionality and the indiscriminate nature of doing this, because a combatant who's having a shower, for example, in a public toilet is clearly not posing a danger. Again, this is a debatable matter, but there's no debate about whether you can set off booby traps that are then going to be are likely to have indiscriminate effects on non-combatants, and that, to me, is the problem with the pagers.
And just looking at Gaza and looking at the findings of what happened in 2014 as well, have you noticed, for example, a change in tactics, or has Israel been more aggressive or less aggressive than it was in 2014 during the Israel-Gaza conflict? What sort of evolution have you seen in this last decade?
Well, the 2014 conflict, which lasted for a period of a few months, so it was much shorter duration than what we've seen in the last year in Gaza, and the casualties amongst the civilians, the deaths of the civilians, were somewhere, I'm speaking from memory, but let me say somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. So just on a completely different order of magnitude than what we've seen. The term that Israel was using at the time was, they were talking about mowing the lawn, cutting the grass, that they had, of course, left Gaza. They removed the settlements from Gaza back in 2005, and that periodically they would have to go in there and, as they said, cut the grass or mow the grass. But what we've seen in the last year, this is not mowing the grass. This is just destroying the whole garden. It's a very different order of magnitude. And of course, as everybody knows, it's raised questions about whether the goal is simply to tame and to master the situation, or whether it is to really, in one way or another, destroy the Palestinian people of Gaza, to get them to make the territory unlivable, so that they leave or perish in one form or another. And that's, of course, what's led to the allegation of genocide, where there is a very serious case and debate going on at the International Court of Justice.
And tell us a bit about collective punishment from a legal standpoint. We hear that used quite a lot with regards to what's happened in Gaza. We've heard it with regards to what's happened in the West Bank. Indeed, we're hearing it with regards to what's been happening in Lebanon, where there's a sense that the entire population of Lebanon is being punished for the actions of Hezbollah that only represent a tiny, well, a minority, let's say, of the Lebanese population. What is the legality when it comes to collective punishment?
Simply, it's illegal. It's quite clear it's illegal. You're talking about punishment, so we want to distinguish between the action on the battlefield, the actual conflict, where there are these issues about indiscriminate weapons or of actually targeting non-combatants. But when you're talking about punishment, this is a different thing. It's not responding to military necessity. It's not a military concept at all. It's just making people pay the price for some act or another. And the rule is very clear that collective punishments are prohibited. There were people who were prosecuted after the Second World War for engaging in collective punishments. The Nazis were famous for this, and they would, there was a case in Rome where I think 33 SS soldiers were ambushed and murdered one day, and Hitler said, well, we're going to kill 10 Italians for every one German. And that was a collective punishment because you're punishing people who had no connection with the crime and who had done nothing to deserve the punishment. So this is prohibited under all circumstances.
There's an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court for Benjamin Netanyahu with regards to his actions in Gaza. I believe Israel has now challenged that arrest warrant. Do you think they'll be successful in their challenge?
Yes, I think you may be running ahead of things because the prosecutor has certainly applied for the arrest warrant. He did that at the end of May of this year, of 2024. And there's been skirmishing now before the chamber of the International Criminal Court that is to issue it. And the latest, apparently, Israel announced this, although it hasn't appeared on the website of the International Criminal Court. They have launched their own formal challenge before the court to the threat that an arrest warrant would be issued. There's nothing that's provided for on that in the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is the operative legal framework for the International Criminal Court, and it simply doesn't allow for a country coming and challenging the issuance of an arrest warrant before it's been issued. So if they do go ahead, and it seems, this is before them now. There are 3 judges. I can't prejudge the result, although I would think that from what I know of it, it's likely that they're going to issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and against Gallant. And then that can be addressed. There are different mechanisms for raising it, although I have to say as well that the main rule in challenging an arrest warrant is you can do it if you're in custody. So it would mean that Gallant and Netanyahu would have to surrender to the court. Then they could challenge the legality of the arrest warrant. But I don't think there are many courts in the world that allow this. Most domestic systems wouldn't, where you could send your lawyer to the court saying, well, my guy's not going to surrender. He's avoiding the court, but he wants to attack the arrest warrant anyway. So the short answer then is, I don't see that there's a way forward for Israel on that. They have attacked it through various proxies in a procedure that's now closed before the pretrial chamber for making submissions about some of the legal issues relating to the issuance of the arrest warrant. But that was all ended in early August, and Israel itself chose not to make a submission. Some of its friends did. Some of the friendly countries, like Germany, made submissions to the International Criminal Court, but Israel didn't. Now it says, and this was announced only a few days ago, that they had made a formal complaint or contestation. But I don't see where that fits in the procedure of the court. So I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. And be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.